Hello everyone. Tonight we're stepping into the beautifully exhausting life of an ancient warrior, a job description that mostly involved scars, hunger, and a very short retirement plan. From wearing gloves full of bullet ants until you screamed yourself hoarse, to charging Roman legions while completely naked and painted blue, to guarding cattle like your entire honor depended on the way a cow chewed grass. Warriorhood was less glory, more constant absurdity. If you enjoy this kind of slow dive into the strange, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually like being gently traumatized by history. And I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. It always amazes me that these stories stretch across time zones as easily as they stretch across centuries. So go ahead, dim the lights, maybe make yourself tea, or just let the hum of your room wrap around you. And together, let's wander into the rituals, the raids, and the scars of the warrior's life. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Forget pastel nurseries, stuffed animals, and someone shoving a baby monitor next to your head to check if you're breathing. If you'd been born into a tribal world where survival meant someone else didn't survive, your very first cries weren't celebrated as cute. They were assessed like a market test. Does this little bundle of noise look sturdy enough to carry a spear one day? Or should we not get too attached? See, in many ancient tribes, male birth was basically a future military draft notice written in placenta. Among the Spartans, weak infants might literally be abandoned at Mount Tegeta's nature's version of a performance review. Among nomadic steppe peoples, a boy was sometimes marked with rituals immediately. Tiny cuts or burns meant to scar over into visible badges of endurance. Cute baby photos. Not happening. Instead, you got scar tissue as your first baby blanket. And mothers, well, they didn't just coo and sing lullabies. In the Maasai tradition, for example, women would openly hope their sons grew into warriors, even if that meant exposing them to early pain. The idea was clear. If you can't handle discomfort at 6 months, how on earth are you going to face down raiders on horseback at 16? Childhood wasn't a sanctuary. It was probation. You weren't just you. You were already future warrior material. Priests, elders, or just the nosy grandmother down the path would look at your tiny arms and say, yes, this one could hold a spear. Or, more ominously, best give the gods another try next year. Your existence was political before you could crawl. And the omens, oh, the omens. In Germanic tribes, a birth could be read alongside the flight of birds or the crack of thunder. Did lightning split the sky as you emerged? Congratulations. Thor probably wants you dead young in battle, which is somehow considered a blessing. In Africa and Oceania, scarification or ear piercing might mark you as claimed by ancestral spirits from birth, which sounds poetic until you realize it meant your life wasn't really yours to begin with. You belonged to the tribe, the ancestors, and the warpath. If you survived infancy, and let's be clear, many didn't, your first years were already a test run for endurance. No padded cradles, no sterilized bottles. You were slung against your mother's body while she worked, slept beside smoky fires that stung your lungs, and gnawed on whatever root or animal fat was available once your teeth arrived. Every cough was a coin toss, every fever a gamble. But if you pulled through, congratulations again. The tribe read it as proof that you'd been toughened by the spirits for a warrior's life, and there was no illusion about peace. Even in relatively quiet regions, conflict was never far. Raids, skirmishes, retaliations. War was seasonal, like harvests. You were born knowing, or rather, your parents knew for you, that the role of warrior wasn't optional. It was your social contract, signed in blood, before you could even hold a reed. So, no, you weren't born into innocence. You were born into conflict, into a role waiting for you before you had a name. And as soon as you could toddle, someone was already thinking, when do we put something sharp in this child's hand? By the time you could walk without falling flat on your face, your tribe had a plan for your limbs. Forget playgrounds, forget swing sets. Your playground was a patch of dirt. Your toys were sticks, and the point wasn't fun. It was practice. Wrestling with other kids wasn't just about who could throw who into the mud. It was an early draft of hand-to-hand combat training. If you got bruised, fantastic. Bruises were progress reports. Among the Spartans, this process had a job title, the Ag. At age 7, you'd be hauled off from your mother and tossed into barracks with other boys to live a state-sponsored crash course in violence, obedience, and public humiliation. Meals were deliberately sparse, not because of famine but because hunger was part of the curriculum. You'd be encouraged to steal food, but punished brutally if caught. The lesson: a warrior must be clever, but never careless. But the Greeks weren't unique in their cruelty. On the Eurasian steppes, Sarmatian boys were put on horseback practically before they could walk. Your legs, still spindly, were tied to a saddle, your tiny hands wrapped around a bow. There's no training wheels for war ponies. You either figured it out, or you fell, and falling usually meant trampling, which meant good luck explaining that to your ancestors. Childhood, there wasn't a gradual ramp up, it was galloping straight into adulthood at terrifying speed. In the Americas, Plains tribes trained boys with running contests, fasting, and vision quests. You'd be expected to go into the wilderness alone, starving and shivering, until the spirits finally decided to show you a dream. If they didn't, you came back ashamed. If they did, you came back marked as someone chosen for warriorhood. Imagine your friends at age 12 posting on TikTok, while you're out in the woods hallucinating from dehydration, hoping for a divine thumbs up. Even play was structured like combat rehearsal. Boys in sub-Saharan Africa were handed miniature spears and sent to herd cattle, where play meant keeping predators away. The Maasai, for instance, didn't teach bravery with bedtime stories. They handed you a spear and pointed at a lion. You could either become a man by surviving the encounter, or become a tragic cautionary tale told at the next fireside. And don't think girls were always spared. Among the Scythians, women trained alongside men, archery and horseback, inseparable from daily life. The Greeks later romanticized them as Amazons, but in reality, many steppe women fought because they had to. War didn't discriminate by gender when survival was on the line. Childhood discipline for them meant practicing draw strength on bows until their arms burned, because raiders weren't going to politely wait for the men to return home. Your body wasn't seen as tender, fragile, or in need of protecting. It was raw material, to be hammered into usefulness. Pain wasn't a side effect, it was the method. Every cut, every hunger pang, every shiver in the cold was part of your tuition. And if you cried too much, well, the tribe didn't see tears as sensitivity, they saw them as wasted water. By the time you were 10, your peers in modern suburbs might have been trading Pikmin cards or nervously learning fractions. You had already been taught how to bleed without whining and how to run until your lungs felt like sand. Childhood wasn't about finding yourself, it was about losing yourself in drills, so that, when the tribe called, your body reacted before your mind had a chance to protest. And once you were disciplined enough to take orders, it was time for your first real gift, not a toy, but a weapon. Your first real gift wasn't wrapped in ribbons, it was cold, heavy, and probably chipped your fingernails when you tried to lift it. A spear, a bow, maybe a stone-headed club, whichever version of sharp point your tribe specialized in. Forget the sentimental baby's rattle. This was your initiation toy, and it came with one rule: don't stab yourself before proving you can stab something else. Among the Zulu boys were introduced to throwing spears, the ikwa, early on. You weren't expected to kill with it yet. At first it was about learning balance, aim, and not looking like a complete embarrassment in front of older warriors. In the Amazon, boys practiced with miniature bows, their fingers raw from the twine, arrows tipped with blunt points until they graduated to the poisoned kind. It wasn't child's play, it was a rehearsal for survival, one slip away from permanent consequences. And what better way to practice than hunting? Your first kill was less about feeding the family and more about testing whether you could keep your hands steady when blood was involved. Deer, boar, antelope, it depended on the landscape. If you grew up in the steppes, maybe you brought down your first hare with a bow while galloping, because apparently shooting a moving target from a moving horse was considered basic skills. If you were in the Arctic, a seal or caribou was your exam. And don't romanticize it. The kill wasn't noble or clean. It was messy, exhausting, sometimes humiliating when you missed for the 10th time and got laughed at by cousins. But eventually, you'd land the shot. The animal would fall, and in that moment you weren't a child anymore. Your blood pressure rose, your stomach turned, but you'd just crossed a line. In many tribes, that moment was marked with ritual. A smear of the animal's blood on your forehead, maybe a cut on your arm to let your blood mingle with its. Among the Inuit, a boy who killed his first seal was fed a piece of its liver raw, meant to bind hunter and prey. Romantic in theory, In practice, it probably just tasted like iron and regret. Weapon training wasn't just about utility. It was spiritual, political, symbolic. Weapons carried lineage. A bow passed down from your uncle. A spear carved from sacred wood. Among the Celts, swords were considered so personal they were buried with their owners. The message was clear. Your weapon wasn't just an object. It was your other half, your resume, and your gravestone all at once. And don't think this was optional extracurriculars. If you failed to take 2 weapons, you weren't reassigned to accounting. You were ridiculed, marginalized, sometimes even suspected of cowardice or witchcraft. A warrior culture didn't have patience for pacifists. Your worth was measured in your ability to aim, strike, and kill. And the tribe noticed everything. Did you flinch at blood? Did you miss the rabbit? Did you show hesitation when asked to finish off a wounded animal? These weren't small details. They were the first cracks in your reputation. So by adolescence, your playtime had hardened into hunts. Your toy stick had turned into a sharpened one, and you'd already gotten a taste, literally and figuratively, of what violence meant. And if you thought hunting was the final test, think again. That was just preparation for the real initiation, the painful, bloody, humiliating rites designed to tear the child out of you and leave only the warrior. By the time you'd killed your first animal and learned not to drop a spear on your own foot, the tribe decided it was time for the real fun, your initiation, which of course had nothing to do with cake, balloons, or awkward dancing. In warrior societies, passage into adulthood was measured in scars, blood, and whether you could endure pain without screaming loud enough to wake the ancestors. Take the Spartans, for instance. Their rite of passage wasn't a graduation ceremony. It was a flogging contest at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Boys were whipped in front of cheering crowds until they passed out, and the one who lasted longest was celebrated like a celebrity. If you survived, you weren't just applauded, you were declared forged by the gods. If you didn't, well, let's just say no one carved most likely to succeed on your tombstone. Across the ocean, in the Amazon basin, boys from certain tribes underwent ordeals involving ants, not the cute picnic-invading kind, but bullet ants, insects with a sting described as being shot, repeatedly, for hours. The ritual involved weaving live ants into gloves made of leaves, and forcing the boys to wear them while dancing. Cry out, fail, fail, faint, fail. Survive multiple rounds while your nervous system melted. Congratulations, you're a man now. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, circumcision rites marked the transition, but it wasn't done quietly in a sterile room. It was public, symbolic, and performed without anesthesia. The entire point wasn't the cut itself, but your reaction. If you so much as twitched, the community read it as weakness. If you stood stone-faced while your skin burned and blood ran, you'd proven your courage before the gods, your ancestors, and your very judgmental neighbors. And then there were the vision quests among plains peoples of North America. Instead of physical mutilation, the trial was deprivation. You'd be sent alone into the wilderness, no food, no water, no company, until you either fainted from exhaustion or had a vision. Spirits might come to you in the form of animals or ancestors. If they didn't, you'd return ashamed, half-dead, and considered spiritually unworthy of carrying the warrior mantle. Childhood ended, not with applause, but with hallucinations and hunger. Even the supposedly gentler rituals were terrifying. In Polynesia, boys were tattooed as a form of initiation, the ink hammered into their skin with sharpened combs. The process lasted hours, sometimes days, and infections were common, but the scars were permanent proof of passage. Your body was now literally rewritten as a warrior's body, in a language of blood and ink that couldn't be erased. What united all these diverse rites was the same idea: to rip childhood away from you in one brutal performance. You weren't allowed to slip gradually into adulthood. You had to be broken, reshaped, and rebuilt in public view. The tribe wanted certainty. If you flinched at an ant bite, how could you face raiders at dawn? If you trembled at the knife, how would you keep your composure when spears rained down? So you endured. You clenched your jaw. You swallowed your screams. You watched the ground blur as pain tried to drag you under. And when it was over, you weren't comforted. You were congratulated. Because from that moment on, you were no longer a boy, no longer potential. You were a warrior in training, your body marked forever, your role irreversible. And now that you belonged fully to the warpath, the tribe would teach you to wear that role, not just in scars, but in the way your very skin and body appeared before battle. Now that you'd survived your initiation, scarred, tattooed, or permanently traumatized, the tribe decided your body wasn't just a body. It was armor, canvas, advertisement, and sometimes a scarecrow designed to rattle enemies before the first spear was thrown. Forget steel breastplates or polished helmets. Most tribal warriors didn't have the luxury of metallurgy. What they had instead was creativity, turning skin into armor and blood into insignia. Among the Maori, you'd sit for hours while a sharp chisel tapped ink into your face, carving out the moko tattoos that made your very skull a war mask. The deeper the grooves, the more it hurt, and the more impressive the final result. A blank face was anonymity. A tattooed one was social currency. When you walked into battle with swirling black lines across your cheeks, you weren't just a man, you were an omen with legs. And then there was paint. Glorious, terrifying paint. Celtic warriors charged Roman lines with lime-spiked hair, bodies smeared in blue woad, and little else. Imagine facing an army of screaming, half-naked men glowing blue in the torchlight. Their skin literally dyed with alkali so caustic it burned. The Romans, armored to the teeth, admitted it was unnerving. Which was the point. You might not pierce their shields with your first strike, but you'd pierce their nerves. Across the Amazon basin, warriors smeared themselves with uricum, that vivid red dye from the inato seed, covering their bodies like walking flames. The message wasn't subtle. You weren't just fighting a man, you were fighting someone already cloaked in the color of blood. And in some cases, warriors wore bones, claws, or feathers as if to say, "I've killed these before, and you're next on the list." Even scars were curated. In West African societies, scarification wasn't just decoration, it was proof. Raised patterns across the chest or arms were public records of endurance. Each cut endured without flinching was a line in your resume. By the time you faced battle, your skin was a portfolio of pain tolerance. Enemies read your body before they read your spear. And let's not forget charms and amulets. Warriors from the Zulu to the Inuit carried little packets of herbs, bones, or carved stones, believed to turn blades or absorb arrows. Did they work? Absolutely. In the same way modern lucky socks win sports games. But here's the thing, belief is half the battle. Marching into combat convinced that your pouch of lion hair made you invincible often made you act invincible, which in turn terrified people who weren't so lucky. But body as armor wasn't just about scaring the enemy, it was about dissolving the fragile self. When your skin carried paint, scars, tattoos, charms, you weren't you anymore. You were the tribe embodied. You were ancestor and omen, walking graffiti for divine power. The human body, once soft and breakable, was transformed into a living banner that could not be ignored. And when your body had been turned into a billboard, it only made sense that the next step was learning how to wield the tools that would make that billboard feared, the weapons of your people. Your weapon wasn't just a stick with a point. It was the axis around which your entire identity spun. To modern eyes, a spear looks like simple technology, a sharpened shaft of wood, maybe tipped with stone, bone, or metal if you were lucky. But in a warrior's world, that spear was family, spirit, and passport rolled into one. Lose it, and you weren't just disarmed, you were disgraced. Among the Zulu, the short stabbing spear, the ikwa, was a revolution. Shaka Zulu redesigned it to force close combat, ripping apart the older style of throwing spears. Suddenly, warriors weren't skirmishing from a distance. They were chest to chests, stabbing so close the name ikwa came from the sucking sound of the blade leaving a body. Your weapon wasn't abstract, it was a sound lodged in everyone's throat. On the Eurasian steppes, the bow was practically a body part. Composite bows, bent from layers of horn, sinew and wood, could send arrows tearing through armor at shocking distances. Steppe warriors practiced until they could fire backwards at full gallop, casually turning their horses into mobile missile platforms. The bow wasn't a tool, it was a lifestyle. You grew up stringing, unstring, oiling, bending, until the flex of sinew felt like the flex of your own muscles. And then there were clubs and maces, underestimated but devastating. In the Amazon, hardwood clubs carved with sharp edges could crack skulls in a single blow. Among the Polynesians, clubs were often carved with divine symbols, each strike considered not just violence but ritual judgment. Swing one of those, and you weren't just hitting a man, you were channeling gods who didn't bother with subtlety. Metallurgy. When it arrived, elevated weapons into something bordering on supernatural. The Celtic sword, long and leaf-shaped, wasn't just iron hammered into form. It was forged with rituals, quenched in special waters, sometimes even killed at burial by bending the blade so it wouldn't be stolen. Blacksmiths were half artisans, half shamans. They weren't just crafting weapons, they were birthing spirits in metal, and everyone knew not to anger the man who could coax a killing edge out of fire. Even throwing weapons carried myth. The otlatl, that spear thrower used in the Americas, could send a dart farther and harder than your arm ever could on its own. Archaeologists find them decorated with carvings of animals and spirits, reminders that technology was never just mechanics. It was theology you could fling across a battlefield. Your weapon told your story. A nicked blade showed experience. A decorated shaft displayed status. A poisoned tip whispered that you'd learned the chemistry of death. And unlike clothes or tattoos, you didn't shed it. You slept with it, prayed with it, were buried with it. It was an extension of you, one you could never afford to misplace. But here's the irony. Despite the sacred aura, weapons weren't used every day. Most of your life was still spent farming, herding, or hunting. The spear leaned against the wall, waiting. And when it was finally picked up, the first battles you'd fight weren't against rival tribes. They'd be against animals, hunts designed to blur the line between predator and prey, and remind you that killing was your new normal. So, you've got the scars, the tattoos, the spear that doubles as your resume, and now you imagine your days will be filled with heroic duels and glorious raids. Sorry to disappoint, but being a warrior most of the time looked a lot like being everyone else. You herded cattle, you farmed millet, you hauled wood, patched huts, or repaired fishing nets. In short, even warriors needed dinner. That didn't mean your identity disappeared when you laid down the spear. Among the plains tribes of North America, warriors were also hunters, expected to bring back bison not just for family, but for the community. Killing wasn't reserved for enemies. It was embedded in your daily routine. If you couldn't track and kill, you couldn't eat. Your skill with the bow or spear mattered just as much in the grasslands as it did in the battlefield. And then there was herding. Among the Maasai, young warriors, or Moran, were responsible for guarding cattle, the true wealth of the tribe. Raids often targeted livestock, so watching cows chew grass all afternoon wasn't just boring rural work. It was armed babysitting, with the threat of enemy spears always hovering at the horizon. A lazy afternoon with cattle could turn into a skirmish in minutes. But daily life also meant ceremony. You didn't just exist as a warrior. You performed warriorhood, even off the battlefield. Feasts, dances, storytelling nights, all revolved around reinforcing who you were. Among the Norse, this meant boasting rituals. You stood around a fire telling stories of battles or hunts, half boasting, half warning rivals not to test you. In other places, like the Pacific Islands, dances and chants were rehearsals for war, where foot-stomps and hand gestures were choreographed intimidation campaigns. Think less community theater, more terror ballet. Still, let's not over-romanticize. A lot of your daily life was just waiting. Raids were seasonal, battles occasional. Most days, your weapon leaned against the wall while you dug in the fields, wove nets, or carried water. It wasn't glamorous. It was survival. But the difference was, you carried the expectation that at any moment, you'd need to drop the hoe, grab the spear, and turn survival into combat. That constant edge, that hum of readiness, was what set you apart. And downtime wasn't exactly peaceful. Warriors were expected to stay sharp. Running contests, wrestling matches, sparring, you trained as much as you worked. Your body was seen as public property, not in the modern exploitative way, but in the literal sense that if you let yourself go soft, the tribe's defense collapsed. Nobody wanted to be the guy who got winded halfway through a raid because he'd skipped morning sprints. So yes, most of your days looked deceptively ordinary. Herding, planting, fixing, hunting. But the difference was that every routine was threaded with violence waiting to happen. You weren't just a farmer. You were a farmer with a spear at arm's reach, living in a cycle where the line between feeding your family and defending them was thinner than the edge of your blade. And when that line broke, when routine cracked and violence erupted, warfare itself took center stage, not as endless carnage, but as ritual, economy, and destiny, shaping when and why your spear left the wall. If you thought war was chaos, surprise, and desperation, you'd only be half right. In many tribal societies, warfare was as regular as the seasons. Crops got planted, rains arrived, herds migrated, and then came the raids. Conflict wasn't some tragic accident, it was part of the calendar. Among the Aztecs, for instance, you didn't just fight to win land. You fought flower wars, arranged battles specifically to capture enemies alive for sacrifice. Imagine a soccer league where the goal wasn't to score points but to drag the goalie home for ritual disembowelment. Victory wasn't measured in territory, it was counted in warm, terrified bodies hauled back to the temples. Elsewhere, the logic was economic. Among pastoralist tribes in Africa and Central Asia, cattle raids were practically investment strategies. Your herd grew, not just by breeding, but by stealing. Wealth walked on four legs, and every raid was a higher-risk loan repayment. You'd ride out, drive off a neighbor's cows, and hope they didn't come back next season with double the numbers. These weren't just petty squabbles, they kept the economy moving. Even Viking raids were less about random bloodlust, and more about resource management. Scandinavia's thin soils couldn't support large populations, so warriors sailed out, hit monasteries or villages, took silver, grain, slaves, and redistributed them back home. Pillaging wasn't vandalism, it was foreign trade, minus the polite haggling. And here's the strange part. War often doubled as ritual theater. In the New Guinea highlands, intertribal battles sometimes played out like staged performances. Warriors lined up, painted and screaming, hurling spears in choreographed exchanges. Casualties happened, yes, but sometimes the fighting was as much about display, courage, and negotiation as about annihilation. You might call it symbolic violence, though if you caught a spear through the ribs, it didn't feel very symbolic. War was also how you paid spiritual debts, a death in your family. Someone needed to die in return, or the ancestors would sulk. In feud-based systems, raids spiraled endlessly, each side avenging the last raid until no one remembered the original insult. Violence wasn't random, it was bookkeeping, blood as the ledger entries of cosmic balance. And don't forget prestige. A young warrior couldn't just farm forever and expect respect. You had to raid, capture, or kill to earn status. Among the plains peoples, counting coup, striking an enemy with your hand or stick, and escaping alive was sometimes more prestigious than killing. The point wasn't the corpse, it was the story you could tell later around the fire. So war wasn't always about extermination, it was about maintaining cycles of wealth, honor, revenge, and ritual. That's why it returned again and again, not as catastrophe, but as expectation. Everyone knew the season would come when the spears came down from the rafters, the cattle got rounded, or the gods demanded new captives. And when the season arrived, it wasn't just about when you fought, it was about how. Tactics weren't random chaos, they were patterned, practiced, and terrifyingly inventive, each tribe carving its own logic into the art of killing. Let me ruin the Hollywood picture for you right away. Tribal warfare rarely looked like two neat armies charging across an open plain while inspirational music swelled in the background. No, it was messier, smarter, and often terrifyingly theatrical. Take the Celtic tribes facing the Romans. They weren't shy about noise. War horns blared, warriors shouted insults, weapons clanged against shields. It wasn't random chaos, it was psychological warfare. The point was to rattle the enemy before the first spear even left your hand. Some warriors even fought naked, painted blue with woad, their bodies both armorless and terrifyingly defiant. The message being, "I'm so confident I don't even need clothes." Imagine facing that before breakfast. Elsewhere, tactics leaned on the land itself. Amazonian tribes fought in dense forests where ambushes were the rule. You didn't line up, you vanished into the foliage, arrows raining from invisible perches. The environment was the formation. To step into enemy territory was to walk into a trap you couldn't see until it stung your skin. The steppe nomads of Central Asia rewrote the rule book entirely. Their cavalry moved like liquid across grasslands, firing arrows while retreating in a maneuver later called the Parthian shot. They could feign flight, luring enemies into overextending, then wheel back in for slaughter. Two sedentary farmers used to straight-line clashes. It was like trying to fight smoke with pitchforks. And let's not forget river crossings and raids. In parts of Africa, warriors practiced sudden strikes timed with floods, crossing swollen rivers to appear where no one expected. Surprise wasn't an accident. It was a tactic cultivated with seasonal precision. Even timing was a weapon. Formations weren't always about straight lines or rigid ranks. Sometimes they were about creating illusions. Among Polynesian warriors, battle dances before combat weren't just warm-ups. They were a tactical tool, building group cohesion, psyching themselves up, and projecting terror. A wall of stomping, chanting bodies wasn't just intimidating. It was organization disguised as chaos. Even the smallest gestures mattered. Shield walls, feints, ambushes, cavalry sweeps. They all told a story meant to confuse, frighten, or overwhelm. Warfare wasn't just muscle. It was theater laced with blood. And yet, beneath the noise and choreography, there was always a deeper layer. The belief that no formation, no spear thrust, no ambush succeeded without the backing of the spirits. Which meant before the battle began, you weren't just painting your body and sharpening weapons. You were preparing your soul. If you think war was just men with sharp sticks yelling at each other, you've underestimated how much of it was fought in the invisible world. For many warrior cultures, stepping into battle without spiritual preparation was like walking into a storm naked. You weren't just arming your body, you were armoring your soul. Take the Zulu warriors. Before raids, they didn't just sharpen spears, they drank potions brewed by diviners, smeared protective medicines onto their bodies, and chanted ancestral praises until their blood practically vibrated. Every stab, every strike, wasn't just your arm moving. It was the ancestors guiding the blade, or the Norse berserkers who turned spiritual preparation into something much stranger. They howled, bit their shields, foamed at the mouth, and entered trance states so deep they fought as if pain had been deleted from their nervous systems. Archaeologists still argue whether it was mushrooms, alcohol, or sheer madness fueling them. Either way, charging an enemy who looks possessed by wolves was less combat and more encounter with nightmare fuel. The Amazonian tribes leaned on hallucinogens to warriors, drank brews like ayahuasca before raids, visions twisting the jungle into a theater of spirits. Enemies weren't just men anymore, they appeared as demonic forms, glowing, threatening, unreal. And if you believed your own hallucinations, your arrows weren't just wooden shafts. They were bolts of cosmic justice aimed at monsters. Even amulets mattered. Warriors carried pouches filled with bones, herbs, or animal parts. A claw from a leopard, a sliver of bone from an ancestor, a feather tied to a spear. These weren't decorations. They were insurance policies against the unseen. Lose your amulet, and you didn't just feel unlucky, you felt naked. In West Africa, charms called grease were worn to deflect bullets or blades. Did they actually work? Physically, no. Psychologically, absolutely. Belief has its own kind of armor. Convince yourself you can't die, and you'll charge harder, fight longer, terrify your enemies more. And sometimes, sheer conviction changes the outcome of the clash. But spiritual combat wasn't only about protection. It was about framing killing as sacred. When you speared an enemy, you weren't just eliminating competition for cattle. You were fulfilling cosmic order, avenging ancestors, pleasing gods. War was theater for the divine audience, and when the battle ended, you didn't just walk home and eat dinner. You purified yourself. Washings, smoke baths, fasting, all to cleanse the blood you'd spilled. Without ritual closure, you risked dragging angry spirits into your hut at night. For warriors, the line between battlefield and spirit world was never neat. You fought in both arenas, and victory was only secure if you managed to win in both. But of course, none of this happened in a vacuum. Your bravery, your spirits, your scars, they weren't just about you. They tied directly into the tribe's politics, kinship ties, and endless jockeying for power within your own camp. Being a warrior wasn't just about stabbing outsiders. It was about surviving the tangled web of obligations inside your own tribe. You weren't just someone's son, you were someone's pawn, cousin, bargaining chip, or headache in the tribal power game. Take marriage. Among the Maasai warriors, Moran was celebrated, painted, sung about, but they weren't exactly free agents. Who you married wasn't up to romantic sparks around the fire. It was determined by clan alliances, dowry negotiations, and whether your bride's family brought enough cattle to the deal. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about livestock arithmetic. Your wife was both a person and a political treaty. The Plains peoples of North America ran a different variation. Prestige in war made you a more desirable suitor. Counting coup, touching an enemy in battle without killing him, was sometimes more attractive than piling up bodies. Why? because it showed bravery without destabilizing the tribe's cycle of vengeance. Your reputation in combat could literally decide whether someone's father let you marry their daughter. And let's not pretend family life was peaceful. Among the Norse, brothers could just as easily be allies as rivals. Blood feuds sometimes started over inheritance, spiraled into clan wars, and dragged whole communities into endless revenge loops. Being a warrior meant never forgetting that the man across the fire from you, your cousin, might one day try to kill you if land division went sour. In Central Asian steppe societies, kinship politics shaped entire armies. A Khan's sons weren't just family. They were generals, rivals, potential youth. Fighting for your clan also meant fighting within your clan, balancing loyalty to brothers while keeping a knife tucked away in case one of them decided the throne looked better on his head. Even daily alliances were political minefields. Among many tribes, who you ate with, hunted with, or stood beside in formation mattered. Each gesture signaled loyalty. Sit in the wrong place at a feast, and suddenly whispers spread that you were aligning with a rival faction. Warriors didn't just fight with weapons, they fought with seating arrangements. And then there was bride capture, common across parts of Africa, Asia, and even Europe in earlier periods. Raids weren't just about cattle, they were about women. Kidnapping a wife from another clan might elevate your prestige, but also spark blood feuds lasting generations. Your household, in other words, doubled as both a love life and a powder keg. So when you picked up your spear, you weren't just defending your tribe. You were defending your kin group's honor, your cousin's dowry, your uncle's land claim, and your future children's social standing. Every strike, every raid, every trophy tied back into the messy knots of family. And if you managed to survive both battle and domestic politics, there was an upside: prestige. Because nothing elevated your status faster than war spoils, songs of bravery, and the right to sit at feasts with your scars showing. So, you've survived your initiation. You've swung your spear in the right direction, and now comes the payoff. Spoiler: nobody's handing you a paycheck. Warrior societies didn't deal in coins, they dealt in prestige. And prestige, unlike cattle or silver, couldn't be stolen. It had to be earned, displayed, and remembered. Among the Plains peoples of North America, the bravest warriors weren't necessarily the ones with the longest kill list. Counting coup, that ritual of touching an enemy and escaping unharmed, was considered the pinnacle of courage. Why? Because it showed you could get close enough to kill, but chose to risk your life for honor instead. Killing was easy. Surviving mockery of death was harder. That single gesture could earn you more respect than a pile of scalps. Speaking of scalps, yes, they were trophies. And not just in North America. In Celtic Europe, warriors sometimes nailed enemy heads to their doorposts as proof of valor. Archaeologists have literally found preserved skulls in Iron Age sanctuaries, left like eternal calling cards. Brutal, yes, but in a world without medals, a severed head was the closest thing to a gold star sticker. In West African societies, scars on your body were also trophies, but internal ones. Surviving wounds in battle gave you visible proof of bravery. Each scar was a public CV line etched into your flesh. You didn't need to tell stories, your body spoke first. Too few SCRs, suspicious. Too many, legendary. Feasts and songs were the real salary. In Norse society, warriors were immortalized by skalds, poets who turned battlefield moments into sagas. Win glory, and your deeds lived on in verse, echoing long after your bones rotted. Lose anonymously, and you disappeared from memory as if you'd never existed. The same was true in Africa and Oceania, where oral traditions preserved names of the boldest warriors, often sung for generations. And let's not ignore material spoils. Raids brought cattle, grain, wives, jewelry, or weapons. Warriors might be rewarded with the best cuts of meat at feasts, or first pick of captured goods. The logic was simple: risk your life, reap the prize. But the real treasure wasn't the extra goat or necklace. It was your new standing in the tribe. Because prestige wasn't just ego, it was political capital. Earn enough, and you weren't just a warrior. You became a leader, a decision maker, maybe even chief material. Prestige opened doors, forged alliances, and made sure your children inherited status instead of suspicion. But prestige wasn't permanent. You had to keep proving yourself. Stop raiding, stop fighting, stop bleeding for the tribe, and people forgot fast. Warrior societies didn't have retirement parties. They had the constant question: What has he done lately? And when lately became too hard on your aging knees and scarred hands, your role shifted. You no longer proved yourself by bleeding, but by teaching others how to bleed. Every spear eventually grows too heavy. Every bowstring eventually snaps your fingers instead of the air. And every warrior, no matter how ferocious in youth, eventually finds that knees, backs, and lungs aren't particularly impressed by past glories. Aging in warrior societies wasn't retirement with a pension plan. It was a negotiation. How do you stay relevant when you can no longer sprint into a raid without wheezing like an old goat? If you were lucky and skillful, you transitioned into a new role, the advisor, mentor, or storyteller. Among the Plains peoples, older warriors were prized for their memories of raids and hunts, teaching younger men how to track, ambush, or escape with skin intact. Your scars, once battlefield trophies, became teaching tools, each raised line a paragraph in the autobiography carved into your body. In Sparta, aged warriors still carried weight in council, their experience shaping decisions even if their spears stayed sheathed. Wisdom there wasn't sentimental. It was tactical, knowing when to push, when to retreat, when to exploit terrain. You were no longer the point of the spear. You were the hand guiding it. Among the Maasai, older Moran who passed the warrior stage entered elderhood, trading spears for staffs. But don't picture a soft retirement. Elders judged disputes, controlled cattle exchanges, and guided rituals. Their authority was political and spiritual, forged out of decades of discipline. Your voice, once loud in battle cries, became heavier in decisions. Succession was where things got tricky. Who replaced you wasn't random. In many societies, warrior status was passed through lineage and training, not simple inheritance. Your sons didn't automatically get your prestige. They had to earn it. But your reputation helped. A famous warrior father made for a head start, especially in cultures where genealogies were recited like legal contracts. And sometimes succession wasn't just about family, it was about factions. Younger warriors jockeyed for position, proving themselves in raids, while elders quietly decided who showed the right mix of ferocity and control. Too much arrogance, and you risked destabilizing the group. Too little courage, and you weren't worth following. The dance between youth and age was constant, sharp, and often political. Of course, not every aging warrior got the dignified exit. Some were sidelined, their scars dismissed as outdated currency. Some were ridiculed for clinging to relevance, mocked for repeating stories too often around the fire. And in harsher societies, if you couldn't pull your weight, you became expendable. Old bones didn't always get honored burials. Sometimes they just got left behind. Still, in the best cases, aging gave you a kind of untouchable gravitas. You'd sit by the fire, younger men leaning in as you recounted ambushes, betrayals, miraculous escapes. You might not hold the spear anymore, but you shaped how the next generation carried it. And that mattered, because while you whispered wisdom into the ears of the young, storms were brewing. Tribes didn't remain untouched forever. Eventually, empires arrived with iron, cavalry, gunpowder, forces that made your lifetime of scars suddenly look obsolete. For centuries, your world made sense. You fought with spears, raided for cattle, proved yourself in pain rituals, and carried your prestige in scars and songs. Then one day, outsiders appeared, sometimes from over the sea, sometimes marching in phalanxes, sometimes armed with technology that looked like sorcery. And suddenly, everything you thought made you invincible collapsed like a hut in a storm. Take the Gauls and Germanic tribes against Rome. Their warriors fought with wild courage, charging in loose formations, shouting, brandishing long swords. But Roman legions moved like a single machine, shields interlocked, spears thrust in unison. What was once terrifying, a wave of half-naked painted warriors broke against Roman discipline, like surf against stone. Your personal bravery couldn't pierce a wall of iron and drilled obedience. In southern Africa, the Zulu built one of the most formidable indigenous military systems in the 19th century. Shaka's reforms turned young men into regimental machines, armed with the short stabbing spear and trained in encircling tactics. They crushed neighboring tribes and terrified colonists until rifles and artillery arrived. The assegai was brilliant against shields. It was less impressive against bullets fired from half a mile away. Or the Plains tribes of North America. For generations, mounted warriors ruled the open grasslands. On horseback, armed with bows, lances, and later rifles, they fought US cavalry to stalemates again and again. But industrial warfare wasn't a seasonal raid, it was relentless. The US government didn't just send soldiers, it sent railroads, telegraphs, endless waves of settlers, and a strategy that starved tribes by annihilating the bison. You could be the best horseman alive, but no horse outran extinction of your food source. Even in the Pacific, warrior societies that thrived on raids and ritual warfare found themselves dismantled by outsiders with cannons and naval power. Polynesian war dances that once terrified rivals now played out in front of muskets that didn't care how fearsome your face paint looked. It wasn't just weapons, it was worldview. Empires fought for conquest and integration, not ritual balance. They didn't respect truces based on seasonal raids. They didn't value honor scars or ancestor omens. They wanted land, resources, submission permanently. Warrior cultures built around cycles of vengeance and prestige couldn't adapt fast enough to industrial slaughter, and so decline came, not because warriors grew weaker, but because the ground shifted under their feet. The scarred elder, the painted raider, the horse archer, all suddenly looked outdated against gunpowder, bureaucracy, and global trade networks. The very skills that had defined manhood, power, and survival were recast as primitive. But decline didn't erase memory. Warriors didn't vanish. They became symbols, romanticized, feared, or repurposed. The songs, scars, and painted bodies lived on in oral traditions, artifacts, and the nightmares of colonizers who knew they'd dismantled something terrifyingly resilient. And when the dust of conquest finally settled, one thing remained: memory. Because long after the spears rusted, the stories of warriors carried on in sagas, songs, and graves, ensuring that even in defeat, the image of the warrior refused to die. When your spear finally slipped from your hands for the last time, your role as warrior didn't end. It just shifted from flesh into memory. Because warrior cultures, even in defeat, were meticulous archivists, not with paper and ink, but with songs, stories, bones, and scars that outlived the bodies carrying them. Among the Norse, warriors who died bravely were folded into sagas, their deeds woven into poetry, so their names echoed in longhouses centuries later. Not every warrior reached Valhalla, of course, but if you were lucky enough to fall spectacularly, you became part of a narrative bigger than your corpse. Die quietly, though, and you vanished. History was selective, and mediocrity had no bard. In West Africa, griots preserved warrior histories orally, singing genealogies and recounting battles. A skilled warrior might never see his face carved in stone, but his story could pass down 20 generations, woven into the collective memory of the people. To be remembered was survival beyond death. To be forgotten was a second, crueler death. Archaeology has uncovered how tribes remembered their dead in more tactile ways. In Europe, bog bodies, warriors thrown into peat, with their weapons were preserved for millennia, their contorted faces still testifying to violent ends. In Scythian kurgans, burial mounds yielded horsemen laid to rest with bows, swords, and sacrificed animals. Entire portable armies entombed underground. The message was simple: a warrior's worth wasn't buried, it was displayed, and sometimes memory wasn't sacred at all. Warriors became currency in someone else's narrative. Conquerors rewrote histories, painting tribal fighters as savages to justify their own brutality. Colonial accounts often erased complexity, flattening warriors into caricatures, wild men charging with spears against rifles, destined to lose. Yet cracks in those stories remain, revealing the truth that these fighters often outmaneuvered, outlasted, and terrified empires far longer than polite textbooks admit. Modern museums add another layer of irony. The same weapons once raised in terror now sit behind glass, labeled with neat captions. The same warrior tattoos once feared as omens are now printed on tourist t-shirts. The memory of warriors, sanitized and commodified, circulates far from the fields where blood once dried in the grass. But even through distortion, something stubborn lingers. The warrior remains a symbol of courage, resistance, identity. In some communities, rituals survive: dances, chants, scar patterns, even when spears have turned to props. The memory isn't just nostalgia, it's resistance against being erased entirely. So yes, the tribes fell. Their lands were taken, their weapons outclassed, their systems dismantled. But the warriors, They refuse to vanish neatly into footnotes. They haunt the sagas, the graves, the songs, the myths. They sit in the silence of museum halls, staring out from behind glass as if daring us to forget them. And if you'd been one of them, your bones might still be out there, a scarred skull in a mound, a tattooed fragment in the soil, or just a name someone whispers by firelight. That's the final legacy, to be gone, but never entirely. In many warrior societies, childhood didn't end with a birthday, it ended with bruises. The first clear line between a boy and a man wasn't when his voice cracked, or when he grew taller than his mother. It was the day his community decided he could withstand pain without flinching. Beatings weren't punishment, they were ritual. Violence was not a social failure but a curriculum, a way of writing adulthood into skin. Among the Spartans, this was explicit. At the altar of Artemis Orthia, boys were whipped before a crowd, sometimes until blood pooled on the temple floor. Endurance wasn't optional. Fainting or crying out in front of spectators meant humiliation so deep that death might have been preferable. What began as a religious festival turned into a yearly theater of pain, where the whip became the priest's tool for sculpting citizens. In Africa, the logic repeated with regional variations. Among the Kosa boys undergoing initiation into manhood were beaten as part of circumcision ceremonies. These weren't quiet family affairs. The entire community watched, elders gauging whether the initiates trembled or cried out. To endure silently was to emerge transformed, not merely circumcised but reborn as warriors. In waiting, to fail was to carry the shame of weakness into every future interaction. And the paradox was everywhere. Societies that relied on warriors also relied on pain as the glue of masculinity. Boys weren't prepared to fight by being sheltered. They were prepared by being battered, cut, and exposed until pain became as familiar as breath. To bruise a child was, in this logic, to polish him. Tenderness didn't forge fighters. Raw endurance did. Pain was not hidden away. It was staged, public, and celebrated. A child's scream was the sound of failure. A child's silence, the applause line. Every welt or scar was a receipt proving that softness had been burned out, leaving only the beginnings of a soldier. And once the lesson had been drilled in by leather, sticks, or fists, the ritual deepened. The next step wasn't just enduring beatings, but surviving ordeals so severe that endurance itself became spectacle. In Sparta, flogging wasn't a scandal, it was a festival. At the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, boys were lined up in front of crowds and whipped until their bodies split open. The altar itself was said to drip with blood so often that the stone turned dark with iron stains. Locals didn't whisper about child cruelty, they brought their families to watch. Pain was a civic performance, as essential to Spartan life as the gymnasium or the battlefield. The ritual had a religious excuse, of course. The goddess demanded sacrifice, and instead of goats or bulls, Sparta offered up the flesh of its sons. Priests, armed with whips instead of knives, became sculptors, chiseling courage into skin. The contest wasn't about survival alone, but about composure. A boy could be beaten until he collapsed, but if he stayed silent, he won. Groaning, begging, or fainting too early meant dishonor, not only for himself, but for his kin. The stakes were higher than bruises. Some boys died under the lash. Their deaths weren't treated as tragedy, but as proof that they had pleased the goddess, that they had crossed the threshold into manhood in the most uncompromising way possible. By bleeding out under the community's gaze, what modern minds might call brutality, Spartans called purification, and the crowd cheered. Parents, siblings, elders, all bore witness, not with pity, but with pride. The spectacle reminded the city that its strength was built on the erasure of childhood softness. What mattered was not survival of the body, but survival of composure. Pain was not private suffering. It was public evidence that the boy was learning to belong to something larger than himself. The flogging festival blurred boundaries, part sacrifice, part theater, part military drill. It trained boys not just to endure pain, but to treat endurance itself as the highest civic virtue. A Spartan soldier, after all, was expected to hold a shield wall until death, not until discomfort. The lash at Artemis Orthia rehearsed that lesson in miniature, imprinting on skin the demand for absolute obedience to the collective. And while Sparta has become shorthand for extremity, it wasn't alone in this logic. Across the world, other societies found equally inventive ways to fold pain into education, ensuring boys didn't merely grow, they hardened. Across much of Africa, the passage from boyhood to warriorhood was marked not by a birthday, but by a wound. Circumcision, ceremonies, and initiation camps carved the difference into flesh, often accompanied by beatings so relentless that the body itself became the diploma. Among the Xhosa, initiation meant seclusion, circumcision, and a battery of tests that included lashings by elders. Boys sat in rows, bleeding from fresh cuts, while men armed with sticks struck them to test composure. Crying out wasn't simply weakness, it was humiliation for the entire family. To endure in silence meant not just personal pride, but collective honor. The Fulani practiced something similar in the Sharo ordeal. Young men stood in open fields, stripped to the waist, while rivals lashed them with canes in front of cheering crowds. The challenge was simple: no flinching. The boy who endured longest without collapsing was celebrated as brave, marriageable, and worthy of carrying weapons. Pain was currency, and only those who could spend it lavishly earned the status of manhood. Among the Maasai, initiation into the ranks of warriorhood, the Moran involved circumcision without anesthesia. Elders held the boy steady as the knife did its work, and the unspoken law was clear: no twitch, no grimace, no sound. A single movement, a single cry, stained not only the boy's reputation but his family's as well. The scar wasn't just physical, it was social. The common thread was unmistakable. Boys were expected to prove that pain could not break them. The beatings were not random cruelty. They were pedagogy, teaching through agony that a warrior's body didn't belong to himself. It belonged to the community, to the ancestors, to the rhythm of raids and battles waiting beyond the village. And the spectacle mattered as much as the suffering. Entire communities gathered to watch. Songs were sung, insults hurled, laughter mingled with blood. Pain was communal theater, and the audience judged harshly. A boy who faltered became a cautionary tale, whispered about long after the wounds healed. But those who endured, who stood rigid as welts rose, as blood trickled, as eyes watered but never spilled, emerged transformed. They weren't just men. They were warriors in waiting, recognized by scars as legitimate heirs to a lineage of endurance. And just as the whip and stick prepared the body, other cultures invented more imaginative ways of teaching the same lesson, sometimes by replacing leather with venom, and sticks with living insects. In the Amazon, boys weren't whipped into manhood, they were stung into it. Among the Satamor of Brazil, initiation meant shoving your hands into gloves woven with hundreds of bullet ants. Not pinned ants, not dead ones, very much alive, their mandibles clamped shut, their stingers exposed, thrashing inside like a storm of needles waiting for skin. The bullet ant is infamous, even among entomologists. Its sting is described as the most painful on Earth, rated at the very top of the Schmidt Pain Index, a scale invented by a scientist who had the dubious hobby of letting insects bite him. Victims compare it to being shot, electrocuted, or having nails driven under the flesh, except the agony lasts for hours, rolling in waves that leave muscles spasming. And boys didn't wear the gloves once. They wore them for minutes at a time, forced to dance and chant as if the experience were joyous. Then they removed them, trembling, their hands swollen and useless. When the pain subsided days later, they did it again and again. Tradition demanded 20 rounds before a boy could claim the title of warrior. Each session left scars, not just on the skin but deep in the memory, a reminder that warriorhood was never about comfort. The ordeal wasn't hidden. Elders watched, approving or disapproving, judging the slightest whimper. Mothers stood at a distance, silent, knowing the screams of their sons weren't to be comforted but endured. Every sting was a syllable in the language of adulthood, spelling out the difference between child and man. The logic matched that of Sparta or the Maasai, but with an Amazonian twist. Instead of whips or knives, nature itself became the instrument of initiation. Pain didn't just come from human hands. It came from the forest, as if the jungle itself conspired in shaping warriors. And if beatings and stings weren't enough, some societies refined pain into contests, turning combat itself into a ritual rehearsal for war, stick against stick, bruise against bruise, until boys learned that endurance wasn't an exception. It was the job description. In many warrior societies, beatings weren't just inflicted by elders or priests. Sometimes the blows came from peers, staged in ritualized combat that blurred the line between training and torture. Boys didn't just grow into warriors, they sparred their way into it. Among the Dinka of South Sudan, stick fighting became the central test of youth. Armed with long poles, boys clashed in public arenas, their ribs, arms, and skulls open targets. There were rules: no thrusting, no killing blows, but the contests still left scars, broken bones, and the occasional death when limits were ignored. Each welt was proof of courage, each victory a step toward manhood. To flinch or retreat too quickly was to invite ridicule that could last a lifetime. The Zulu took similar logic into stick duels, known as isiduku. Young men squared off with slender sticks, overseen by elders who ensured fights didn't escalate into murder. But the goal wasn't safety, it was conditioning. Every strike hardened the body, every bruise rehearsed the reality of real combat. By the time a boy became a Moran, his skin had already been mapped with lines of pain. Even in the Mediterranean, echoes of ritual combat existed. Ancient Greek festivals included mock battles where blows were exchanged in rhythm, part sport, part military drill. Violence became choreography, training bodies to absorb shock as naturally as breath. And the fights weren't private. Communities gathered, forming circles around the boys, clapping, cheering, laughing at the timid, exalting the bold. Stick fights were social theater, just as much as Spartan whippings or African circumcision ordeals. Pain was never solitary. It was communal currency, measured and displayed before the collective gaze. The lesson was brutal but consistent. If boys could endure blows from friends, they could endure worse from enemies. Pain wasn't a side effect of training, it was the training. Combat trials weren't about winning. They were about teaching the body to stop recoiling, to stop fearing the thud of wood on bone. A warrior wasn't someone who avoided pain. He was someone who treated it as background noise. And when sticks weren't enough, cultures found even slower, more permanent ways to carve pain into flesh. Sometimes the beating wasn't a strike at all, but 1,000 tiny punctures hammered into the skin with ink and bone, transforming the body itself into a ledger of endurance. In Polynesia, the path into warriorhood often ran through the tattooist's comb. Tattoos weren't light, symbolic doodles etched in sterile studios. They were hammered into flesh with bone or shell tools. The skin punctured over and over, until blood and ink mixed into one raw layer. Pain wasn't a side effect, it was the point. The Samoan pea, a full-body tattoo stretching from waist to knee, could take weeks to complete. The boy lay still while assistants pulled his skin taut, and the tattooist tapped the inked comb with a mallet, puncturing thousands of times in a single sitting. Infection was common. Some initiates fainted, some died, but to endure without complaint was to emerge as a man marked permanently as a warrior and member of the community. Among the Marquesas, tattoos were even more elaborate, covering the body in dense geometric patterns that transformed the skin into armor made of symbols. Every strike of the comb was a miniature beating, administered in ritual rhythm, while family and friends looked on. If the boy endured, the tattoos became lifelong evidence of his resilience. If he faltered, the unfinished designs became scars of shame, visual proof of weakness displayed for all to see. The process wasn't rushed. It was spread over days or weeks, the pain returning again and again, hammering not just the skin but the spirit into shape. The endurance wasn't about showing courage for a few seconds, as in a duel or a lash. It was about showing discipline, grit, and silence over the long haul. Warriorhood here was a marathon of agony, not a sprint, and the tattoos themselves weren't decoration. They were identity. The patterns linked the warrior to his ancestors, his clan, his land. To carry them meant to wear history on your body, inseparable and permanent. The body became both a book and a shield, its lines read as social status and promises of endurance. Pain as ink, ink as memory. A warrior was written into being by needles and hammers, and once the body had been beaten into permanence, some societies turned inward, demanding not just decorated flesh but suffering visions, ordeals where the boy himself inflicted pain to call down spirits who would confirm his role. Among many warrior traditions, the final exam wasn't surviving lashes or enduring tattoos. It was facing pain alone, with no crowd to cheer or shame. On the North American plains, boys were sent into isolation for vision quests, a ritual that blended fasting, sleeplessness, and sometimes self-inflicted wounds. Hunger gnawed, thirst burned, and the silence of the prairie pressed in like another enemy. For the Lakota, piercing ceremonies were the most brutal expression of this logic. Boys had their chests or backs pierced with wooden skewers, tied to thongs fixed to a central pole. Then came the ordeal, dancing in the sun, straining until the flesh tore, releasing both blood and spirit in a single violent offering. The suffering wasn't symbolic, it was literal proof that the boy had been tested and chosen. To break free too soon, or to show fear, meant failing not only the ritual but the ancestors themselves. Elsewhere, fasting and isolation alone did the work. Days without food or water drove boys into fevered states, where visions of animals or ancestors arrived as confirmations of destiny. A warrior wasn't self-made, he was revealed. But revelation came only when the body had been stripped down to bone and nerve. When pain and deprivation dissolved ordinary consciousness, self-cutting and scarification often accompanied the visions. Stripes of wounds carved into arms or legs reminded the initiate and everyone who saw him that endurance was his first language. Each cut was both a question and an answer. Can I suffer? Yes. Will I belong? Yes. Unlike public beatings, these ordeals weren't about spectators. They were about proving to the spirit world that the boy could withstand suffering without mediation. The absence of an audience made the ordeal harsher. Without applause, without family watching, pain became the only companion. The boy either broke or emerged with the kind of certainty that only comes from dancing at the edge of collapse. And while some cultures sent boys into forests or deserts, others institutionalized the process, creating entire systems where brutality became daily curriculum. Instead of a single trial, pain was rationed across years, baked into every lesson, until warriorhood was less a rite than an education in cruelty. In some societies, beating boys into warriors wasn't limited to a single rite of passage. It was woven into the school day. The Spartans, famous for their agi, raised cruelty into a kind of civic pedagogy. Boys were removed from their families at the age of 7, corralled into barracks, and handed over to instructors who believed affection spoiled soldiers. Hunger was deliberate, theft was encouraged, but discovery was punished with lashes. Pain was constant, systematic, and formative. The whip was not a rare punishment, but a routine management tool. Boys who failed in drills, who spoke out of turn, or who simply annoyed their overseers were beaten. Bruises weren't seen as disciplinary excess. They were as natural as homework. By adolescence, the skin itself carried the record of education, stripes of leather, welts of wood, reminders that in Sparta, pain was a textbook. The Aztecs mirrored this logic in their Comicac schools, where the sons of nobles were raised for priesthood and warfare. Beatings were a daily occurrence, delivered with thorny sticks or maguey spines. Children who nodded off during rituals had their ears pierced with cactus needles. Laziness wasn't scolded, it was bled out. Endurance, obedience, and discipline were carved into the flesh before boys ever saw a battlefield. Other cultures embedded the same principle in subtler ways. In parts of Oceania, boys undergoing initiation were confined in men's houses for months, subjected to constant discipline, sometimes including ritual beatings meant to harden their bodies and strip away childishness. The message was consistent. Suffering wasn't an accident of training, it was the training. Institutionalized brutality wasn't about sadism for its own sake. It was a calculated method of mass-producing soldiers. One boy's pain was a personal test. A whole generation's pain was a guarantee of military readiness. Systems like the Agi or Comicac didn't just create individuals who could endure agony, they created societies that expected endurance as the baseline. And this expectation wasn't kept private. Communities were invited to witness, to evaluate, and to celebrate the spectacle of suffering. Pain became performance, not only endured but displayed, turning the beaten child into the centerpiece of collective identity. In many warrior societies, beatings weren't tucked away in private corners. They were staged as communal rituals, open-air theaters where boys became exhibits of endurance. The lash, the stick, the ant glove, these weren't just ordeals. They were performances, and everyone was invited to watch. In Sparta, flogging at Artemis Orthia wasn't an obscure rite hidden in temples. It was a festival, complete with spectators and applause. Parents, priests, neighbors, and children gathered to witness boys writhing under whips. The event blurred punishment, sacrifice, and entertainment. The altar turned red, the crowd cheered, and the line between cruelty and devotion vanished into civic pride. The Fulani Sharo ordeal in West Africa carried the same logic. Young men stood shirtless in open fields, facing rivals armed with whips. The community circled, shouting encouragement or insults, gauging composure. Flinching brought ridicule, stoicism brought admiration, and collapse brought shame. Pain was never private, it was graded in public, sealed by the crowd's memory. Even in Amazonia, the bullet and gloves were not endured in silence behind closed doors. Elders gathered, mothers stood at the edges, children whispered, and the boy danced through agony under dozens of eyes. The audience wasn't incidental, it was the point. Without witnesses, endurance carried no social weight. The spectacle converted suffering into social currency. A boy's screams or silence were remembered, repeated, woven into gossip and songs. A single grimace could haunt him, while a single show of composure could elevate him. Communities didn't just observe, they transformed pain into narrative, ensuring that everyone understood who had earned the right to wield weapons. The spectacle also reassured the collective. By watching boys beaten and remade, the community saw its values reaffirmed. Endurance, courage, loyalty, all crystallized in sweat and blood on public display. Pain wasn't simply tolerated, it was necessary proof that childhood softness had been burned out in front of everyone. And underlying it all was the cultural conviction that without these public crucibles of suffering, warriors wouldn't truly belong. Which explains why pain wasn't treated as incidental but as sacred, a tool for transformation, not just of individuals but of entire societies. The repeated beatings, lashings, piercings, and ordeals weren't random cruelty. They were cultural grammar, a language written on the body. Across continents, the logic converged. Only through pain could a boy be trusted with the responsibilities of a warrior. Endurance became the test of belonging. Pain stripped away childhood. A boy who cried out during circumcision in the Maasai Highlands, or who collapsed too soon under Spartan whips, was marked not just as weak but as socially unfinished. Without scars, he wasn't yet a man. With them, he carried visible proof that he had been remade. The public nature of the ordeals reinforced the lesson. Enduring in silence before the eyes of elders, peers, and ancestors proved loyalty to the group. Pain wasn't endured alone, it was endured for the community. Without witnesses, suffering lost its meaning. With witnesses, it became social capital, inscribed forever in memory and reputation. And the body itself became text. Tattooing in Polynesia, scarification in West Africa, welt lines from sticks in Sudan, all transformed skin into records of suffering. Each mark carried layered meaning, proof of resilience, connection to ancestors, authorization to join raids, eligibility for marriage. Pain wasn't wasted. It was converted into status. Underlying this was a belief that suffering purified. To bleed was to be cleansed. To ache was to be reshaped. Endurance wasn't simply training for battle. It was preparation for life in societies where hunger, loss, and violence were constants. If a boy couldn't withstand ritual pain, how could he withstand war, famine, or death? So the beatings continued, flogging altars in Sparta, sharrow fields in West Africa, and gloves in the Amazon. Each culture spoke a different dialect, but the language was the same. Pain as initiation, pain as proof, pain as belonging. Warriors were not born, they were beaten into existence. Their identities forged in ceremonies where agony wasn't a byproduct, but the essential ingredient. And in that relentless logic, one sees the haunting consistency of human societies across space and time. The conviction that the path to strength is carved into the flesh, and that only by mastering pain can one be trusted with power. In the ancient world, war was never just about territory, resources, or prestige. It was about cosmology. To march an army into the field without ritual preparation was like trying to rewrite the universe with a blunt stick. For most societies, battles weren't viewed as clashes of men, but as disturbances in the order of the cosmos, something that had to be justified to the gods, ancestors, or the unseen world before the first spear left the hand. Among the Mesopotamians, kings didn't simply wake up and decide to invade a neighbor. They consulted the gods through divination tablets, omens in the sky, or the livers of sacrificed sheep. If the cosmos gave its approval, war could proceed. If not, the army stayed home. A war fought without divine sanction wasn't just risky, it was cosmic treason. In West Africa, the Yoruba saw conflict as entangled with spiritual balance. Before battle, warriors and their leaders sought guidance from Ifa diviners, throwing palm nuts and reading patterns to interpret the desires of Orunmila, the deity of wisdom. To ignore the message risked not only defeat but spiritual collapse, where ancestors turned their faces away and left the community exposed. Even the Romans, whose legions became the template of military efficiency, couldn't untangle their wars from the sacred. No campaign began without priests performing rituals, no triumph was celebrated without sacrifices, and no defeat was explained without reference to some forgotten vow. Mars wasn't just a god of war. He was the paperwork officer who had to sign off every time soldiers put on their armor. The logic stretched beyond permissions. War was conceived as an offering. Victory meant the gods had been satisfied. Defeat meant someone had neglected a ritual, ignored an omen, or failed to cleanse impurity before the march. Armies could be stronger, better equipped, more disciplined, and still lose because the failure wasn't in tactics but in theology. War was sacred because it had to be. For societies living with constant uncertainty, famine, flood, disease, rival raids, the idea that bloodshed unfolded on a purely human level was intolerable. To frame it as spiritual order gave meaning to the chaos. A spear through the gut wasn't just a violent accident. It was a message from the heavens about who deserved to rule and who had fallen out of balance with the divine. And so, before swords ever clashed, eyes always turned upward, downward, or inward, searching for signs, omens, or permissions that might tilt the fate of men. The first battlefield was never the plain or the forest. It was the sacred space where war had to be approved, negotiated, and sanctified. From there, it made sense that the next step was always to ask the gods themselves, through entrails, smoke, birds, or the occasional unfortunate goat, whether the time for killing had actually arrived. No army ever set out without first interrogating the universe. Generals could count troops, polish weapons, or sharpen strategy, but none of it mattered until the gods signed the permission slip. And the gods, naturally, were cryptic administrators who spoke in guts, smoke, and bird flight. In Mesopotamia, priests read the future in the livers of sacrificed sheep. The organ was sliced, prodded, and mapped like a sacred textbook, each blemish and curve interpreted as divine commentary. If the liver gleamed in the right places, war was blessed. If not, the army went nowhere. The campaign didn't belong to the king. It belonged to the gods, and their opinions were carved into flesh. The Romans kept their own bureaucracy of omens. Augurs watched the sky, passing the flight patterns of birds, as though every sparrow carried a memo from Jupiter. A chicken that refused to eat before battle wasn't just a stubborn bird. It was an omen so dire that commanders sometimes postponed campaigns. Rome, the empire of engineers and roads, still stopped wars for poultry. The Greeks sought clarity from oracles. At Delphi, generals lined up to hear the Pythias riddles, delivered in cryptic verses no one fully understood until after disaster struck. Victories were proof of divine favor. Defeats, naturally, meant someone had misinterpreted the gods' poetry. And in West Africa, Ifa divination guided war councils. Priests cast palm nuts or cowrie shells, arranging them into patterns believed to reveal the will of Orunmila. Leaders asked not only whether they would win, but whether the ancestors approved. To march without their blessing was unthinkable, the equivalent of entering battle with one's own dead lined up against you. Everywhere, the same logic. No spear was raised until the unseen world nodded. Omens gave the illusion of control in a universe that otherwise seemed chaotic. A war wasn't simply a clash of bodies, it was a test of alignment. Man, gods, and cosmos, in precarious agreement. And once that permission had been secured, the warriors themselves had to be made ready. Not with drills or sharpened blades, but with cleansing, because no one dared bring impurity into a fight meant to echo in the heavens. Before warriors lifted weapons, they had to be stripped of dirt, doubt, and anything that smelled remotely human. To walk into battle uncleansed was to carry disorder into a place where cosmic order was at stake. So purification rituals stood at the threshold, scrubbing bodies and spirits alike, until they were considered fit to bleed. Among the Romans, soldiers underwent lustration, a ritual of sprinkling and sacrifice. Animals were slaughtered, their blood and smoke drifting over the ranks as a kind of disinfectant for the soul. The message was blunt. A soldier's sword wasn't clean until he himself had been ritually scrubbed free of impurity. In India, warriors bathed before combat. submerging in sacred rivers or pouring water over themselves to wash away not only sweat, but spiritual residue. A man entering battle unbathed wasn't just unhygienic, he was dangerous, dragging pollution into a space where the gods were already watching closely. On the North American plains, sweat lodges served the same function. Warriors sat in steaming enclosures, sweating out fear, fasting until hunger blurred the edges of reality, and praying until they felt emptied of weakness. Emerging drenched and trembling, they were no longer ordinary men but vessels sharpened for combat. Even in Greece, warriors purified themselves before campaigns. Offerings to gods were paired with cleansing baths and ritual meals. A soldier marching out without such rites risked more than bad luck. He risked being the one whose impurities soured the entire army's fate. Purification was less about cleanliness than about transformation. A man who walked in as a son, husband, or farmer was expected to emerge as something else, an embodiment of the collective, stripped of private ties, reforged as an extension of divine will. Water, smoke, sweat, and blood all worked toward the same end, dissolving the ordinary self so that only the warrior remained, and purification didn't stop at the body. Once washed, an army reached backward and downward, calling not just on gods but on ancestors, dragging the dead into the living ranks so that battle became a dialogue across generations. No army marched alone. Behind every spear line stood the invisible ranks of the dead parents, grandparents, heroes whose names had hardened into legend. War was as much about keeping them satisfied as it was about defeating enemies. To fight without invoking them was like leaving half the army asleep in their graves. In Zulu regiments, warriors began battles with praise songs that weren't just rousing chants, but direct conversations with ancestors. Each name shouted into the air was a reminder that the living carried unfinished debts. Victory wasn't only for the living, it was repayment for blood already spilled. The Maori haka, famous now as performance, began as exactly this kind of invocation. Feet stomped, eyes widened, tongues thrust outward, not for theatre alone but to summon ancestral presence, to call the dead into the living body. Enemies weren't facing just men. They were facing bloodlines, centuries deep, condensed into muscle and bone. Among the plains peoples of North America, war songs sung before battle often named the ancestors directly, embedding the warrior in a chain of obligations. Each verse was a reminder, fight well, or face them in shame on the other side. A warrior carried not only his weapon but the weight of ancestral judgment. In the Pacific Islands, warriors sometimes carried relics of their ancestors into battle, bones, teeth, or carved effigies. These weren't keepsakes, they were reinforcements. To wield a club bound with an ancestor's bone was to wield two bodies at once, the living and the dead. Everywhere, the lesson was the same. Wars weren't private affairs, they were conversations across the veil, negotiated between flesh and ghost. To lose wasn't merely defeat, it was to shame one's lineage. To win was to stitch another name into the ancestral chorus, and if the ancestors walked beside warriors, they had to be protected. Which is why soldiers marched into battle not only with spears, but with invisible armor, charms, talismans, and bits of magic meant to catch blades and turn arrows away. Steel and wood might break, but magic was portable. Across warrior societies, amulets and charms were worn as invisible armor, meant to bend arrows, blunt blades, or at the very least, steady trembling hands. A soldier marched into battle not only wrapped in leather or iron, but in layers of invisible protection stitched together by ritual. In West Africa, grigra bags filled with herbs, stones, or scraps of scripture were slung around the necks of warriors. These weren't souvenirs. Each bundle was prepared by a specialist, charged with the power to turn aside bullets or make the wearer untouchable. Confidence, after all, can be just as deadly as armor. The Romans fastened little phallic charms, festina, onto belts and armor. To modern eyes, they look like jokes. To Romans, they were apotropaic devices, driving away envy and ill luck. A soldier could face barbarian spears with the quiet reassurance that a bronze penis on a chain was keeping. Mars himself entertained. The Norse carved runes into swords and shields, believing that the right symbol etched into wood or iron could infuse the weapon with Odin's favor. A sword wasn't just forged, it was baptized. To wield it without inscription was to walk into battle naked, however much iron you wore. In Islamic traditions, Quranic verses were inscribed on slips of paper, folded into cases, and strapped to the body. Warriors believed the words themselves radiated protection, a wall of scripture thicker than any shield. Even small objects, feathers, teeth, bones, were transformed into defenses. Polynesian warriors wore shark teeth, not as decoration but as reminders of a predator's ferocity carried into combat. The line between jewelry and weapon blurred. Every item carried power, if consecrated correctly. These charms didn't guarantee invulnerability, but they guaranteed belief. And belief was its own kind of armor. A warrior convinced he could not die fought as though immortal, which was often enough to tilt the balance before the first blade struck. But protection wasn't always about wearing tokens. In some places, it meant transforming entirely, slipping into altered states where the line between man and spirit dissolved. And warriors believed they fought with more than human strength. Sometimes the strongest shield wasn't leather, bronze, or even magic charms, but the conviction that the body itself no longer belonged to you. Warriors in many cultures sought to cross a threshold before battle, abandoning ordinary awareness and stepping into altered states where pain, fear, and hesitation dissolved. The Norse berserkers are the most notorious. Before combat, they worked themselves into frenzies, howling, biting shields, convulsing, until they seemed possessed. In this trance, they believed they had taken on the spirit of the bear or wolf, invulnerable to steel and fire. Archaeologists still argue whether hallucinogens fueled it, or sheer ritual psychology. Either way, facing a frothing man convinced he was a predator incarnate was enough to make even a disciplined opponent falter. In the Amazon, warriors drank brews like ayahuasca before raids. The visions that followed weren't distractions, they were strategy. Enemies transformed into grotesque, spirit-filled forms, while warriors themselves felt guided by ancestral presences. Combat became not a clash of men, but a stage where the jungle and the spirit world bled into each other. Across parts of Africa, possession before war was cultivated deliberately. Mediums called spirits into warriors, who shook, shouted, or collapsed before rising transformed, infused with powers not their own. To strike such a warrior was to risk offending the ancestor or deity riding within him. The man was no longer simply a man. He was a vessel, dangerous because he had ceased to be mortal. Even in Polynesia, dances and chants pushed warriors toward trance states. The haka, far more than performance, invoked a collective possession, bodies moving as one. Breath synced, eyes glaring wide, until individuality dissolved. When warriors moved like a single organism, enemies weren't facing men but a storm. These altered states mattered because they redefined the battlefield. Fear, pain, hesitation, all the things that make humans fragile were erased. What remained was fury, conviction, and the terrifying spectacle of warriors who no longer seemed entirely human. And once the bodies were possessed and the minds transformed, the next step was to declare that transformation publicly, through war dances and performances that were as much spiritual invocation as they were psychological warfare. Before the first arrow flew or spear was cast, warriors turned the battlefield into a stage. War began with theater, stamping feet, rolling eyes, painted faces, guttural chants, a choreography designed to summon spirits and shred nerves at the same time. The enemy wasn't just meant to be killed, they were meant to be unnerved long before blades met flesh. The Maori haka is the most famous example. What looks today like spectacle for tourists or rugby matches was once a weapon. Eyes bulged, tongues thrust outward, muscles tightened into grotesque masks. Every stomp of the foot and slap of the chest summoned ancestors, but it also declared to the enemy, "Look at us, we're already possessed." The haka wasn't just intimidation, it was spiritual theater, collapsing fear and faith into one performance. The Zulu regiments worked similarly, chanting in unison, shields clashing in rhythm, feet pounding the earth until dust clouded around them. Their war songs were more than morale boosters. They were invocations, drawing on ancestral power while projecting raw terror across the field. To face such a wall of sound was to feel the ground itself joining the enemy. In North America, Plains warriors used war cries, piercing yells meant to carry across open grasslands. The shrieks weren't random. Each warrior had a distinctive cry, sometimes believed to have been taught in visions, a sonic signature that called both to allies and to spirits. The voice became weapon, slicing into enemy morale before weapons did the work. Even in ancient Greece, where phalanxes marched with rigid discipline, war songs and flutes were deployed to hold rhythm and spirit together. The music bound soldiers into a single pulse, reminding them that they weren't just individuals with shields, but a collective body aligned with the gods. These performances blurred the line between prayer and intimidation. Were they summoning spirits? Yes. Were they terrifying enemies? Also yes. A war dance was a declaration that the battle had already begun in the unseen world, and the enemy was already losing. But to seal that theater with divine certainty, societies often demanded offerings. The gods didn't show up for free. They had to be fed first in blood, smoke, or sacrifice before the first weapon was ever raised. Before battle began, blood had to be spilled. Not the enemies, not yet, but offerings to ensure the gods showed up on the right side. War was expensive, and the first payment was always ritual. Sacrifice was the ancient down payment for victory. Among the Greeks, armies set out only after hecatombs, the slaughter of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of cattle. The smoke curled upward, carrying fat and bone to the gods, while priests prodded the organs for signs. If the livers or lungs looked wrong, the campaign could be delayed. In Homer's epics, sacrifices are less background detail than the actual mechanism by which wars gained momentum. The Romans, inheriting similar habits, sacrificed animals before campaigns and read omens in their entrails. When things went badly, they escalated, performing the rare and unsettling devotio, in which a general vowed his own life to the gods of the underworld, riding straight into the enemy as both commander and sacrificial victim. The Norse offered blood in beeltas, sacrifices of animals, and sometimes humans, staining sacred posts with gore to secure Odin's favor. War without sacrifice was considered suicidal. The Allfather demanded payment in advance, preferably messy. Nowhere was this logic more elaborate than in Aztec flower wars, where captives were taken specifically to be offered before major campaigns. To march without victims was to risk divine indifference. Huitzilopochtli, god of war, had to be fed. The blood of captives wasn't symbolic, it was literal sustenance for the sun. The cosmos itself hinged on the rhythm of sacrifice. Even smaller-scale societies echoed the same rhythm. In parts of Africa and Polynesia, warriors sacrificed chickens, goats, or pigs before setting out. The act wasn't practical provisioning, it was metaphysical bribery, ensuring ancestors and gods had been properly courted. Sacrifice was the hinge between preparation and battle. It declared the field consecrated, the warriors purified, and the gods invested. And once the gods had been properly fed, the weapons themselves had to be addressed, because they weren't seen as tools, but as living beings that needed their own share of ritual. In warrior societies, weapons weren't mute tools. They were extensions of the spirit, sometimes treated with more reverence than their wielders. A sword or spear wasn't simply forged or carved. It was birthed, baptized, and often given a name, as though it had a soul waiting to be coaxed awake. The Japanese katana was never just a blade. Forged through painstaking ritual, it was believed to house the spirit of its maker. Samurai carried swords as if they were living companions. To lose one was to lose honor. To mistreat one was to desecrate a life. Before battles, swords were ritually polished, blessed, and even fed. Sake poured over steel to acknowledge its appetite. The Celts of Iron Age Europe treated swords and spears as sacred participants in war. When a warrior died, his blade was sometimes killed too, bent, broken, or thrown into rivers and bogs so no one else could claim it. Archaeologists pulled twisted swords out of watery graves, evidence that a weapon wasn't a possession but a partner whose life ended with its master's. Among West African groups, spears and shields were ritually consecrated by shamans before battle. Protective medicines were smeared on wood and iron, transforming them into vehicles for spiritual force. The weapon carried not just physical strength but metaphysical potency, believed to bite deeper because it had been awakened. Even the Norse inscribed runes onto blades, believing the marks could summon divine protection or curse enemies. A sword etched with the right symbols was no longer a lump of iron. It was a conduit for Odin's will. Weapons demanded care, ritual, and respect. To neglect them was more than negligence, it was impiety. The spear unblessed, the sword unpurified, was thought to betray its owner at the worst possible moment. A weapon that wasn't properly honored might shatter, slip, or turn useless, as though sulking against its master. This intimate relationship blurred responsibility in battle. When victory came, it wasn't always the warrior who was praised, but the weapon. When defeat struck, the explanation wasn't just poor tactics. It could be that the sword's spirit had turned cold, or the spear had refused to strike true. And when battles were lost, defeat wasn't seen as random. It was interpreted as divine disfavor, the sense that weapons, gods, and ancestors had all abandoned their side. When battles ended in disaster, the explanation rarely stopped at strategy. Defeat was not just a failure of men, but of ritual, of piety, of cosmic alignment. A broken line of soldiers was tolerable. A broken relationship with the divine was catastrophic. For the Romans, defeat almost always meant some ritual had been bungled. A general forgot a sacrifice, misread an omen, or marched on a day the gods hadn't approved. Losses were explained away as lapses in devotion, not tactics. Campaigns sometimes halted until priests retraced every missed prayer, as if repairing the universe could reset the battlefield. In Mesopotamia, kings blamed military failure on divine withdrawal. The gods had chosen to favor the enemy because the rituals hadn't been performed correctly or the temple had been neglected. Victory could be revoked like a loan, with armies paying the price for a missed debt to the heavens. Among the Aztecs, the logic was even more absolute. If the gods demanded blood and it wasn't delivered, defeat was inevitable. A failed campaign wasn't a mere setback, it was cosmic imbalance, proof that the sun itself had been left hungry. To lose in battle was to risk dragging the entire world toward collapse. And in West Africa, defeats were sometimes interpreted as proof that ancestral spirits had turned against the warriors. Diviners would be consulted not about tactics, but about what ritual offense had been committed. Perhaps a taboo had been broken, or a charm ignored. Until the offense was repaired, more war was pointless. This is why defeat was more than humiliation. It was a theological crisis. Armies could recover from losing men or weapons, but not from losing the favor of gods and ancestors. Entire societies unraveled when military collapse was read as proof that the divine order had shifted. Kings were dethroned, priests replaced, and new gods courted in the hope of regaining protection. The battlefield, then, was always a stage where two wars played out at once, the clash of bodies and the clash of cosmologies. Men fought with weapons, but victories and defeats were tallied in the invisible world first. And that is why war, across cultures and centuries, was never simply about killing enemies. It was always about negotiating with gods, appeasing ancestors, and surviving the judgment of the unseen. A reminder that before the first blade struck, the real battle had already been fought elsewhere.